Hi there, and thanks for listening. Now, this is one of the first of a new series of videos that I'm doing, which cover the very basics of studying history. Now, you don't have to be struggling as a student or all lost at sea to get something out of this and to find it useful, because we can all do with going back and thinking about the basic principles from time to time. So this video, very simply, is a quick conversation about what we think history is, or more to the point, what other people have thought history is. Because it's a strange thing to do, studying the past, and very often we're not sure why we're doing it, what we hope we'll gain from it, or what the point is. Time and time again, people will tell you, well, you must study the past to learn from the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them in the future. Well, that's quite a big number if you're at GCSE level or in Key Stage 3, the future of the world being put on your shoulders like that. I'd have to say that, yes, to some extent this is true. But there are all sorts of other reasons to understand the past and understand history as well. Why do you think we study it at school? Of all the things we could study, we study practical things like mathematics and English language, and then there's this strange class where you go in, sit down, and you think about the past. Why do we do this at all? Well, one reason is that we're looking at this very basic idea of change over time. Why change happens over time? What makes change happen? What makes societies change? What makes technologies change? What makes the way things are done change? What makes languages and customs and practices and ideas about things change? This is the really important part of studying history, because if you can understand why change over time happens at all, then it helps you to do this thing that is very useful to your life here in the present and will be very useful to your life in the future. It helps you to think critically about the world. Now, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean going around criticising things and people. What it means is looking at things that we see, perhaps things in the news or things around us, relationships between other people and, our lives, all that kind of stuff, and question why things are as they are. Because if you understand about history, then you will have some idea as to how we've gotten to where we are at the moment. Every country, every society, from the dawn of humanity onwards, has had a past. There have been people in the past that have done things and lived in different ways to us. And the question of how we got from there to here is a very important one, not just for understanding the past, but for understanding the present. Now, the first historians weren't like the historians you see on the television now. They weren't like the historians that write books now. They were living a couple of thousand years ago, predominantly in ancient Greece, but not only there. The first historian that we're aware of was an ancient Greek called Herodotus, and Herodotus wrote down stories. Herodotus thought that this is essentially what history was. It was writing down a collection of impressive and interesting stories from around the world that the Greeks inhabited. And he wrote down these stories, and they were accepted really as being factually true. Now, probably not many of them were. As I'm sure you guys all know, that if you hear a rumour in the playground, it's probably important to check it out before repeating it, or maybe don't repeat it at all. And this is what Herodotus wasn't doing. Now, for much of the following 1,000 years or so, the purpose of history, as we go from the ancient world into the Middle Ages, the purpose of history, of recording stories about people, was really the job of presenting kings and nobles in a good light. Very often they would have somebody who was able to read and write, and who could write down very positive accounts of kings and queens, though not always. The King William I, the Norman conqueror, was often so violent and cruel that even his admirers wrote things in their diaries that were pretty objective and honest about the violence and cruelty of the man. In the early modern period in the time of the Tudors, the Stuarts, and then later the Victorians, history becomes more of a hobby. In the 19th century particularly, we're coming right up to date, this is what we would call modern history. You have very famous historians, people such as Thomas Carlyle, who was one of the great historians of the Victorian era. And for him, history was really something of a hobby. It was far more likely to be done using the kind of the methods that historians use now, using sources and trying to find unearth information. But it wasn't done what we would call academically. Now, if something's done academically, it means it's normally done at university, and it is done by people who are trained academics, who think in academic ways, and who share information with other academics. And this hopefully makes what we do and say more accurate, and it means that we can present new theories on the past. So for most of human history, for most of the time that human beings have been in the world, history has simply been the telling of stories, really. It's only in the last couple of 100 years that we've really tried to make history more, for want of a better word, scientific. And how do we do that? Well, we look at the evidence, the available evidence, and very often there isn't enough evidence for us to be absolutely certain of something. But having a look at it helps us to come to the most likely, the most plausible solution, the most plausible explanation. And we know that probably in 20 years' time somebody will have new information and they'll be able to interpret things in different ways. And so history is never finished. It's an ongoing process where when people come up with new ideas, assuming that they are good ones, for want of a better word, we allow for those new ideas to replace old ones. It doesn't mean to say that the old ones are useless, though, because the way in which ideas change over time about a historical event is as important as understanding the historical event itself, because it can tell us all sorts about the way people think and how the lives they lived and the cultures they lived in and the societies they lived in had an impact on how they talked about the past. So again, there are all sorts of things to be learned by studying how people have interpreted the past at different times. So, in answer to the question, what is history? And that's a hell of a question, by the way. Perhaps an easier thing to talk about is what it is historians do. And historians basically create arguments. Not arguments at home where they, go and start a row with somebody, but they create arguments about historical events. So they put forward a theory. They say that I believe the Norman conquest happened for these reasons, or I believe that the Civil War began for this reason. And then they present evidence that supports that theory and examine the arguments of other historians that relate to that theory. And this is part of just of the very beginnings of understanding what historians do. Now, if you're just starting out studying history, then you probably think, well, this is all quite daunting. I don't know if I could do that. Certainly, I don't know enough about the world to go doing the kinds of things that important historians do in history books. But I'd say that you do this all the time, all day long, every day. What people do all the time is that they see the world around them and they interpret it. They see things happening and they have opinions on it. They look, they use their eyes and their ears to absorb evidence, things they see, things they hear, things they can feel and touch and taste and smell. And then they come up with an approximation in their minds of what must be going on. And this is all historians are doing about the past, but the only thing is because we haven't got a time machine, we can't go back into the past. We have to use other people's senses, really. We have to read about what other people experienced and saw and felt and did in the past, and then try to make sense of that. So we're just making sense of the world, but we can't do it directly. We've got to do it through other people. Now, hopefully, that makes life easier for you guys when you start to think in those terms, and continue listening to the Explaining History Basics videos. And as we go through, we'll look more and more about not just what historians do, but what you can do to really start to push your grades up and to do better and to enjoy history more and to become really part of this really, really rich and exciting and thrilling subject. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll catch you on the next video. Bye-bye.